list, and then suddenly you can't leave the country and have your passport taken. I mean, that's right out of Stalinist Russia.
Indeed it is.
Can you comment on that?
Sure. The issue of travel controls is going to get ever more important. And remember that every case of a country having travel controls, like South Africa, eventually relents and lets people leave, but they can't take their money with them. So capital controls are essential towards keeping people in the country, because you're not much good if you have to leave the country without your capital. But I think they're going to a total travel control system. I think that's what TSA is all about. And that's why I concentrate on strategic relocation relative to North America, because once you do get out of the country, you may not be able to get back in as well. And I happen to believe that most people are going to be able to survive in this country through strategic relocation rather than foreign. And one of my main reasons is this. Having lived overseas in Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Panama, Guatemala, El Salvador, and in Europe, I can tell you that the number of people who believe like we do is just a handful in other countries. They're out there, but there are millions, thanks to your efforts, Alex, and others. There are millions in this country who believe like we do. And the ability to band together and find protection and find safe places with like-minded people is much greater, perhaps 100 times greater here than in other countries. And ultimately, it's going to be that combination of being able to blend in because you speak the language, you're native, to be able to hide by blending in, and having like-minded people who can front for you if you have such a total control system that you have to be underground and have other people front above ground for you. Chances of doing that here are much, much better than elsewhere.
Joel, I agree. My instinct, my gut, my spirit, whatever you want to call it, is educate everybody, expose the globalist, dig in simultaneously, and stand my ground. Instead of running, just while we still have the internet, while we still have the freedoms that our forebears fought so hard for, hit the globalists as hard as we can and just fight on all fronts. There's a full spectrum resistance to their full spectrum takeover. And the fact is, as things get worse, exponentially more people are now waking up. Again, I think the globalists have miscalculated, but it's going to be one hell of a fight.
It is, and for those of us who are high-profile people and who are fighting, we have to look at the strategy of having our eggs in more than one basket. And I talk about that in my book, The Secure Home, and elsewise, that, you have to be wise. It's better to have multiple baskets to maneuver in than it is to have one big fortress that you think that you're going to maintain.
I agree. It's better to have a couple shacks nobody knows about.
That's right. So let me return to the topic of safe places, Alex. There is a major controversy in the movement, and it happens to generally be between Jim Wesley Rawls and myself. He has the redoubt concept, and this is basically 5 states that meet all the criteria for having a military resistance to the New World Order. This is a military-style strategy combined with the ability to grow and do all things and be, and I pick in my highest rated safe places, the same Intermountain West, but I'm not restricted to this military viewpoint. I'm very skeptical of confronting the kinds of powers that we're dealing with. I think that we have to have a bigger base of strategy. And one of those strategies that I talk about in my books is concealment and hiding rather than confrontation. I think it's extremely important that people be willing to say, this is too big for me to confront. I'm going underground. I'm hiding. I'm going to conceal, and I'll wait till it passes over rather than confront. And part of that strategy is having multiple places to go to. If you can't afford that, at least you do low-profile housing. You don't make a high-profile home that's obviously a fortress that invites the kind of attack that some people would love to have with the government. But in terms of safe places, I most often get the question, just tell me where the safe places are, Joel, and I'll move there. And it just isn't that simple, because people have to make a living. And while I don't believe that you have to stay wedded to the major metropolitan areas to make a living, you can do some maneuvering. Very few people are going to be able to live in rural America without being attached to a job. Most people have to have a financial lifeline. I consulted a lot during prior to Y2K. My first edition of the Strategic Relocation came out in 1998. A lot of people did not take my advice to maintain your financial lifetime. They bailed out, they went rural, they had some savings, and they came back a couple of years later and they were calling me and saying, what do I do now? I'm out of money. Self-sufficiency turned out to be a lot more expensive than I thought it was going to be, and I've got no money. And I said, you're going to have to move back into society, reestablish a financial lifeline, and then do this again the right way. And the right way, and I talk about this because most of my clientele who reach strategic relocation can't move lock, stock, and barrel. And so I talk a lot about how to do contingency planning, how to move to the periphery, for example, of a major metropolitan area, how to get out of the ways of the major exit routes for refugees that are going to happen. But I want to talk about that as an example that shows the state that you're in, Alex, in Texas. And in this map are several interesting points. There are yellow areas, which I consider the safe areas in this area. And there's also a lot of red areas that are black and completely red around Dallas, the major population areas of Austin and San Antonio, and large red lines connecting them. These are what I call refugee in and or outflow routes. And it's important to realize that not only to avoid high population density centers, but to watch where those refugees, when food and water is cut off, are going to flow outward into the rural areas. And naturally, most people will flow outward up to 50 miles directly out into the land, but a lot of people will be taking to the roads. The freeway will be clogged, they'll be unusable. And it's very important for people to plan ahead if you're going to stay within a major metropolitan area of how to get out of those areas. And here's the strategies. The first of all is to get advance warning so that you're not on the last train out or you're not in the middle of the pack when you're trying to leave. The second strategy is to be at the periphery of those metropolitan areas so that you're not having to transit an hour's worth of driving to get out of a major metropolitan area through the suburbs as they empty out into the various feeder roads. And the other strategy has to do with the graphic that I put up about retreating exit routes on page 290. This is a very interesting graphic that takes us through New Jersey. New Jersey's the highest density population area because behind it is Staten Island, Manhattan, New York, and all of those people are funneling and going west. They can't go east because there's the ocean. They can either go north, south, or west, and west of that is Philadelphia. All of that has to transit through New Jersey in any direction that they go. And so I try to point out some very interesting thing in the book of how you plan an escape route, because a lot of people don't realize that that the freeways are like islands. They're like moats around you, and they stop you from crossing them. In other words, you have to find roads that go under the freeways where there isn't an on-ramp or an exit. And the reason you don't want to cross a freeway where there's an on-ramp is because those exits or on-ramps will be clogged with people trying to get on or off the freeway. And if you look at Google Maps, you can actually zero down in close enough that you can follow a freeway around the area that you're trying to get out of. And you can pick places that don't have an on-ramp or an exit. They're very few, but if you pick those and isolate those and plan routes to get through there, you can do it. And that's the kind of stuff that really makes strategic relocation very valuable for people.
I want to briefly interrupt you to talk about that general map you have of just the basic ratings of states. I notice places like New York, California, they only have 1 star out of a possible, what, 5 stars?
That's right. And there are some states that have 0 stars, like Hawaii and Florida. These are places that you simply don't want to be. The entire state of Hawaii is going to be a death trap because it's an island. and that island can't grow very much food. The big island has some possibilities, but none of the other islands can grow very much.
Okay, break that down. What would it be like during a real collapse or a nuclear war or total depression if you were in Florida or Hawaii, 0 star, versus things like California, 1 star?
Well, for example, an island is the worst place that you can be, especially one like Hawaii, which is a tempting target for occupation. I don't think in this nuclear war that China and Russia, for example, are going to occupy the United States because there's too many weapons here. They just want to get it out of the way militarily so they can blackmail the rest of the world into submission. But Hawaii is a very tempting target to be occupied. I think China will, in fact, play the role that Japan did with Hitler during World War II. They'll take the entire Far East, including Hawaii, all of the islands, the Philippines, Japan. There's a grudge match between China and Japan. And I'm predicting that they'll also take Australia and New Zealand, which does not make them good retreat sites. There are other negatives about Australia and New Zealand, but that's the worst, is that Australia is selling its soul to China, letting China buy up all of its natural resources. China wants Australia, especially during a war. You'll see that occupied.
Yeah, I saw reports in the Wall Street Journal that over 90% of Australian mines are now Chinese owned and run, and 98% of rare earth minerals worldwide are being mined by the Chinese. Why did the New World Order, Anglo-American globalist, allow that to happen? Is that to lure China in?
Yeah, I think we have seen this ever since allowing Mao to take over and undercutting Chiang Kai-shek militarily. The New World Order has always wanted to build these enemies in order to create the kind of war that would force the world into a New World Order, force the world into a global government, and having a powerful China rattling the cages of the world is just what that does. And unfortunately, I think it's going to happen someday. I think Australia is going to lose its freedom. Now, I do think, for example, that my theory indicates that China will make a deal with the West and attack Russia's rear in order to defeat Russia. China and Russia are only temporary allies. They're co-predators, along with the Anglo-American establishment. Each of these 3 predator centers wants to win over the world. And I think China will help the West take Russia down after they start this war. And in doing so, they'll give back eventually Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, but it won't be until after a lot of damage is done during an occupation.
All right, I want to continue going through this, but the book that's available again at INFOWARS.com, it's essential reading for everybody out there, Strategic Relocation, North America, 3rd edition. But just a brief synopsis, and I know I'm springing this on you, Joel, but I know you can answer it from your perspective. The Anglo-American, global, U.S., England, European elite, their end-game goal, if they had total control, what would they do? Versus the Russians and the Chinese, because I know the Russians are incredibly corrupt, have their own problems. The communist Chinese, very corrupt. But I see the communist Chinese have made deals with the West on eugenics, population. I see the West building them up. So I do see that backdoor deal between the Chi-Coms and the Anglo-Americans. But when I see